Thank you very much, Peter. And in keeping with the tradition of Indigenous peoples, I come from Canada, and the place where I live is the traditional people of the Algonquin. So, Kichikawan, which is a greeting from the Algonquin people, meaning hello to all my new friends. So, I'm trying to condense 500 years of contact between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, and try and put this into some sort of a story for you of why it's so important to think about how you're going to engage with Indigenous peoples and to get your projects going. And the first sort of tip is that S. If ever you write anything down or say to anybody in a document, Indigenous people, and it's going to go to an Indigenous group, that's going to get you off to the first bad start, because under the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the S means that there is formal status to the group that you're dealing with. So always remember that Indigenous peoples. What's that little arrow here? Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. So really, one of the first questions is, could you survive here? Why is Indigenous people so? What's going on with this group of people? Why are we paying so much attention to them? And, well, perhaps if you were in a plane crash and this is where you landed, could you carry on? Could you survive there? What about the knowledge systems that exist with these people? And of course, the Yanomami and many other Indigenous groups can survive quite well in the bush. Yeah. And why? The forest. The forest is our home and our laboratories, our universities, where we acquire the knowledge to be able to survive. 80% of the medicines that rural and poor people use comes from the forest. They don't go to pharmacies, they go to the forest or to the elders or to the traditional people to get their medicines. It's from the forest. And so if oil exploration or mining exploration is going to happen in a forest, you're dealing with the source of their livelihoods and the source of their survivals. Just a quick facts about Indigenous peoples, for those that don't know, about 400 million in the world, 5,000 groups, various types of ethnic groups, in 70 countries. In Canada, we've got 54 language groups, and about 3 are expected to survive because of various development pressures in our own country. And the human development indices. Everybody in this room has a human development indices of around 1 or 2, meaning you've got access to health, access to education, security, hospitals, all that sort of thing. In the Indigenous world, average sort of level of HDI is around 60 to 80. Even in our own country, in my country, Canada, the average HDI of Indigenous groups in our country is around 65, on par with Bolivia. So a couple of quotes from Navajo in the United States: science is not just a white man's thing. And from the UN Secretary General: Indigenous peoples have been developing green economy for years. So something to think about in that term. Now this gets into the story of where we're at today. That quote from 1913, 1932 is from a Canadian manager of Indian affairs, let's call it, in the 30s. There was a policy in the Canadian government at that time to, in quotes, kill the Indian within the Indian. I don't mean physically kill the person, but to extinguish the culture. And that quote sums up that policy directive very well. Then you fast forward to the mid-90s, Voisey Bay, the nickel mine in Canada, the largest nickel mines in the world, where the president of the company made that statement about the value of Indigenous knowledge. There's been quite a shift in Canada, there's been quite a shift in many countries in recognizing the value of Indigenous knowledge for development practice. So really, this is what happens. This is what can happen. We see a lot of wealth in Aboriginal territory. We think that this is going to generate a lot of money for the poor people that live in that area. We see the communities that may look like this, a lot of social issues, a lot of poverty, and we think, well, this development will just be a fix right overnight. It'll be quite easy. But if we're going to be successful with dealing with Indigenous peoples, I'm not an Indigenous person, I'm Scottish, I might be a tribe in some context, but if you're going to deal with Indigenous people, you have got to think less about fact and more about empathy. Because over the last 500 years, there has been an amazing degradation of culture around the world with Indigenous groups. You don't have to go too far in any country to see the suicide issues, the substance abuse, domestic violence, kids that don't go through high school, and on and on. In Canada, we had things called the Indian Agent. Indigenous peoples could not leave their territory without permission first from the Indian agent. They could not buy a tractor unless they got permission first from the Indian agent. Indian people in our own country in Canada could not vote until 1961. So the policy is to get the Indian out of the person. So you have to put yourself in that mindset. 5 minutes already? Okay. Their land, their culture, their kids, all of this has been extinguished over the last 500 years. So you have to deal with the people across from you. To the point where now today, we've got a $1.5 billion project in Canada that is being turned back because people don't want it, because they see that there could be damage to their environment. And they see that as more important to their livelihoods. And wherever you see globalization today, you see resource extraction, and wherever there's a loss of culture, you see a loss of biodiversity. And we don't even know what exists in the bush. You know, the cancer issue, the loss of the forest, there could be the source of cancer cures there, and that's where Indigenous peoples live. The World Bank understands that. There's a huge project underway to try and green national accounts because they see a value of ecosystems, goods, and services, and Indigenous peoples are at the center of that. And just as an example, these are worth $1 billion to the U.S. economy. And look at the value of Indigenous knowledge from a business perspective. $60 billion a year just in natural medicines. So when you're dealing with oil and gas issues, you're also dealing with possibility of knowledge for other business ventures. And also, if you're talking about corporate social responsibility and democratic reform, how you deal with Indigenous peoples is a very strong indicator of how you're going to be seen on the democratic sort of criteria. Here's some examples. Sakhalin Energy, if you want to write down those websites, and Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Report. You can email me and I'll send you this PowerPoint presentation if you want, and you can get these websites, but just some good examples of where projects have gone very well. And another one, an iron mine in Australia, where good consultation resulted in a $100 million saving and commenced 6 months before production. Fantastic. A lot of pressure with industry today. We know that. There's instant publicity through Facebook and things like this. The corporate identity can be drawn down very quickly through negative press and so on. So really the companies are asking themselves, do we want to be seen as an intruder, a good neighbor, or a capacity builder? Shell sees it this way. They want to engage with Indigenous peoples in a very responsible way because it's a source of differentiation from our competitors. You don't have to go too far to see the Brent Spire, the Nigeria, the Gulf spill in Hungary, the tailings spilling in Hungary, to see the problems that when projects go off the rails that can have with local people. A statement here from Barrick Gold. It is our best interest as a company to help our host communities in their efforts to be stable, secure, healthy, and prosperous. So a lot of majors are taking a very serious look at this because of the risk issue. And there are many, many risks that can result from dealing with Indigenous peoples that go off the rails very quickly. There's a good list of them. From the UN Secretary General, the UN General Assembly, just a few months ago, it is evident that throughout the world, Indigenous peoples are not adequately consulted, nor is their consent obtained. The decisions are affecting their rights or interests are being made. That is a very important issue, this issue of consent. I'm going to get to that in a second. You can go to the UN Secretary General for the UN, the Rapporteur for Indigenous Peoples, James and Anya, and he can tell you all about that. We're seeing where there are some companies and countries are dealing head-to-head, and actually the companies are losing because there's so much public support for Indigenous peoples, as we've seen in this case in India, where the government shut down the operation because of the lack of consultation with Indigenous groups that got very, very public and very expensive. Even the Church of England got involved with this case in India. So the arrow and money companies can get away with destroying those in their path with impunity is thankfully drawing to a close. And as Hernando de Soto says, who is the Peruvian economist that deals with land issues, if Indigenous peoples don't arm themselves with tools to deal with their plight of people coming into their territories, they're going to be homeless. And as you can see from some of the examples I'm going to give, they're getting very organized very quickly. Free and prior informed consent. How am I doing, Peter? Okay? Yeah. Okay. I wish I could talk to you about this for more time, but because it's, again, 500 years down to a couple of minutes is a very tough task. FPIC, free prior informed consent. better get under, you better be familiar with that term, because it's like the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's been ratified by most countries of the world. I think the United States is the last country, and they're still sorting that out. But free, prior, informed consent means you have to, before a company can go in, get the consent of that group of people. Now, the IFC recently announced, just a few weeks ago, that they are going to adopt the free, prior, informed consent aspect of the declaration. Most governments of the world are looking at consent meaning consultation without the consent aspect. So the IFC is moving quite quickly on this aspect. And also, within the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, there's this issue of climate change. So when climate change affects the territories of Indigenous peoples, there might be recourse for Indigenous peoples to perhaps sue governments and companies for issues related to climate change.